Things you learn from Christian history number 10. Not everyone welcomes revival. Virtually every revival movement has been criticised for being simplistic or populist or just plain vulgar. Leaders want more people in church, sure, but always provided they are the right kind of people. Chapter 10. Revolution, Reason and Radicals. Galileo, 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 figaro. In 1543, the Polish astronomer Copernicus wrote a book suggesting that the Earth was not actually the centre of the universe, and that it really went around the Sun instead of the other way around. Since it was obvious to everyone that the Earth stayed still and the Sun moved, no one took him very seriously at the time. Then, in 1608, some Dutch spectacle makers arranged two lenses in a tube and invented the telescope. The next day, a work-experienced boy in the lab painted the eyepiece with ink and invented the practical joke. And the next year, the professor of mathematics at Pisa University made his own, much more powerful version, only without the ink. His name was Galileo Galilei, and using this powerful tool, he saw things that no man had witnessed before. It enabled him to see craters on the moons around Jupiter, 10 times as many stars as anyone had ever seen before, and, just as importantly, right through the windows of the nunnery across the road. He used these and subsequent observations, not the nunnery, that was a joke, to prove that Copernicus was right. The Sun was the fixed centre of the universe, not the Earth. Earth was one of several planets that orbited the Sun. His theories caused outrage, although not with the Pope of the time, Urban VIII, who accepted them. Others were not so relaxed. After all, didn't the Bible say that God had established the world, it shall never be moved? Psalm 93:1, in case you're wondering. Galileo was not an atheist, he was a devout Catholic. In his early life, he dabbled with the idea of becoming a priest. Later, though, he had 3 children out of wedlock. He put the 2 girls into a convent to become nuns, because he believed them unmarriageable. But Galileo's observations of nature conflicted with the literal statements of the Bible. So, which was right? The Inquisition let it be known that they were keeping a close eye on Signor Galileo. For a while, he and his supporters were allowed to continue with their researches, as long as it was made clear in their writings that it was all a kind of what if, a series of hypothetical observations, rather than definite statements. It's hard to play let's pretend for long in such circumstances, though. And in 1630, Galileo dropped the pretense. His book, Dialogue about the 2 Major World Systems, made it clear that he believed his observations, not the declarations of dogma. Pope Urban was under pressure to crack down from reactionary forces within the ranks. And so Galileo was asked to come for an interview. In fact, the Inquisition had already passed the book as okay, but then they had second thoughts when it's pointed out to them that it definitely wasn't okay, and that if that kind of thing went on, they'd have to start interviewing themselves. Galileo broke down under torture and threats. Oh no, hang on, he didn't. From the start of the interview, he maintained that he had never believed in the Copernican universe, or rather he had once agreed with it, but then sided with the Church in condemnation of the ideas. It's fair to say that both sides were playing the game. Galileo remained under house arrest for the rest of his life, and his books were officially condemned, but he was hardly the martyr that he is sometimes made out to be. His books remained condemned for 200 years. The dialogue was officially banned for Catholics until 1835. Which is not to say, of course, that the Inquisition and the Church hierarchy knew what they were doing. But then, it's hard to see the stars when your head is so firmly stuck in the sand. Descartes before the horse. See what he did there. In France, René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, read Galileo's work and was thrown into turmoil by the conflict between what Galileo was saying and what the Catholic doctrine had proclaimed. So he decided to rethink things from scratch. He started from the first principles, his own thoughts. I think, he wrote famously, therefore I am. And then he added, I drink, therefore I need a coffee. But while the kettle was boiling, he made a big jump. The idea of God is too perfect to have occurred to a simple man. So it must have been put in someone's mind by God. So, that proved God. 2 sugars, please. It's not really entirely convincing, but it reflects a new approach, an experimental approach, if you like, to theology. Descartes was beginning from a sceptical position, and from a prone position. Much of his best thinking was done in bed, where he would stay writing until noon. Later he had to abandon the whole bed-based routine. When he was appointed tutor to the 22-year-old Queen Christina of Sweden, he would get up at 5 every morning, according to the Queen's demands. Not surprisingly, the strain was too great, and he died a year later, aged just 53. Although it could have been that he caught pneumonia from the French ambassador. However, I blame the early mornings. And since I'm going to be the same age soon, for my own safety, I'm going to take up the bed-based routine, starting immediately. Interesting that Nick Page is writing this about 53, and I am 53 next year. So, curious, very curious. Anyway, back to Descartes. It's not enough just to state things. You have to work them out for yourself. Both Descartes and Galileo were Christians, but they reserved the right to think for themselves. Digging and levelling. On the 1st of April 1649, 4 months after the king was executed, some 20 poor men took possession of a plot of common land in St. George's Hill, Surrey, and started to dig. They were henceforth known as the Diggers, and the Surrey community was the first of over 30 communities that held property in common and sought to reclaim the land they believed had been taken from them. Their leader, Gerard Winstanley, called for land captured during the Civil War to be redistributed. That, he claimed, would turn swords into ploughshares and settle such a peace in the earth as nations shall learn war no more. It was a time for radical movements, understandably because radical Puritans were in control of the entire country. After abolishing the monarchy, Parliament abolished the House of Lords, and then went all John Knox on everyone. Swearing was declared illegal, dancing was banned, along with maypoles, the theatre, and sport on Sunday. Churches were stripped of their ornaments, statues were broken, stained glass smashed, the inns and alehouses were largely closed, and then they cancelled Christmas and Easter. If this sounds repressive, there were some good things. First, the Puritans destroyed most organs. Often these were taken to private homes or torture chambers. Organ builders were almost disappeared. Second, there was genuine freedom of conscience and religious toleration. You were free to go to church or not as you chose. You were free to start your own church or denomination. This did not apply to non-Christians or even non-Protestants, of course. Catholics, Jews and Muslims did not apply. The result was a wild flowering of new sects and radical beliefs. The Muggletonians, for example, great name, strongly believed that anyone who knowingly rejected their teachings was going to hell. So, to avoid inflicting this fate on others, they decided not to tell anyone what they actually believed. They were the first Christian sect to ban evangelism. Amazingly, they survived until the 1970s. They didn't even worship together, choosing just to meet up for discussions. Then there were the Adamites, who certainly met for worship, but were accused of doing so in the nude. The Grindletonians from Yorkshire believed that true Christians could achieve perfection on earth, although how that was possible in Yorkshire they didn't say. And then there were the Ranters, who were a kind of catch-all, bogeyman, heretical sect, who believed in pantheism and discarded all worldly moral rules. This lot were at the stranger, seriously unworldly end. But there were several movements like the Diggers that had a much stronger emphasis on politics and social change. Perhaps the most famous of these political activists were the Levellers, led by John Lilburne. He was a devout Christian who had been in trouble with the authorities since before the war. He relentlessly campaigned for his freeborn rights, which earned him the name of Freeborn John. The Levellers, like the Diggers, pointed to the example of the Garden of Eden, where all men were levellers. They preached equality for women, called for all working men to have the vote, for one-year parliaments, the abolition of the House of Lords, religious toleration. They also called for MPs to have no outside interests. Still some way to go on that one. For both the Diggers and the Levellers, things ended in violence. The Digger communities were broken up by landowner-orchestrated campaigns of violence, harassment and arson. The Levellers were marching on London when they were captured and confined in the church at Burford. On the lead font you can still see the engraved graffito of one of their number, Anthony Sedley, 1649, prisoner. 3 days later, on 17th of May, 3 of their leaders were taken out and shot, while the remainder watched from the rooftop. A year later, there was another significant development for Western Christendom. The first coffee house opened in Oxford in 1650, followed by one in London in 1652. A Parisian coffee house had opened in 1643, but knowing French coffee, it's probably rubbish. Coffee had developed in the 10th century in Ethiopia, eventually arriving in Europe via Mecca, Turkey, and then Spain. I'm not sure when it was first served after church services, but whenever it was, it definitely A, tasted rubbish, and B, was served in those cheap green cups with the 3 rings going round them. It has since become as much a part of Christian life as reading the Bible, saying your prayers, and sleeping through the sermon.